Hi everyone, Phil Travis here, and the lesson this week is a brief lesson on something that's really lifted up very highly in American society, and that is the idea of natural rights. So, John Locke, who is in the bottom picture next to Jefferson, John Locke is the philosopher who is generally associated with developing the idea of inalienable natural rights. Inalienable meaning natural rights that everybody possesses and should never ever in any circumstance be infringed upon by a just society. John Locke was a philosopher of the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment, when we say the Enlightenment, we're referring to a particular historical period. Generally, when we talk about the Enlightenment, we're talking about a period in the 17th and 18th centuries in Europe and the Americas, so the 1600s and the 1700s. And the Enlightenment is associated with a scientific and philosophical challenge to the status quo. So the status quo at that time period in terms of truth and knowledge in society was religion, the church. Governments were monarchies. The church held sway, and people did not question the church's conception, for example, of God, of the universe, and so on and so forth. The Enlightenment was a movement driven by influential philosophers and thinkers of all kinds, and scientists, astronomers, that looked at the world, whether the nature of existence in terms of the animals and the creatures of the world, or of the cosmos, or even of the nature of society and ethics. Enlightenment thinkers looked at these things and sought to use reason and logic to understand the true reality of existence. And in pursuing this true reality of existence, many of the Enlightenment philosophers hope to refine and create a more just society. So, many of you have probably heard of, I'm trying to explain this period to you in a very brief moment. Many of you have probably heard of Sir Isaac Newton. Sir Isaac Newton, of course, is famous for discovering the so-called laws of gravity during this period, and his various laws of mechanics and so forth. During the Enlightenment, philosophers, scientists, and thinkers looked to uncover the natural driving forces behind society. And these were forces like, if you remember from other lessons, Immanuel Kant. These were forces that drove ethics. These were forces that could drive societies and governments. These were forces that also could drive the cosmos. So, political philosophers like John Locke, for example, sought to understand the true natural drives of society. And according to John Locke, he found that all people possessed inalienable natural rights, and that these rights were being infringed upon by oppressive monarchical regimes. So Locke hoped to establish through future leaderships these ideas as establishing the basis for more just societies. The goal of Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke or even Thomas Jefferson were to promote ideas that would refine society and would create a more just government. When it comes to political philosophy, if the Enlightenment was about anything, it was about challenging monarchy as an unjust and unnatural form of government, and promote ideas that suggested that there was a way to have a more just and more natural way of organizing the system. For John Locke, these inalienable natural rights were life, liberty, and property. For Thomas Jefferson, who you guys have probably heard of before, one of the founding figures of the United States, these natural rights were life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And these were natural rights, meaning that they were believed to be or considered to be beyond human existence, not created by people, but things that bound all people and that all people had a right to. And again, for Jefferson and Locke, these thinkers of the Enlightenment, monarchies, whether it was King George III during the American Revolution, or whether it was perhaps Louis XIV in France, monarchs repressed justice in society by repressing people's natural rights, which were effectively a natural law endowed in this existence. So now the question is, for the next slide, in the last slide, are natural rights, the big question, are natural rights kind of universal principles that are out there at all times, that everybody sort of has and that every society should uplift? Or are norms of justice and natural rights things that are created by society? Are natural rights something that just societies create? That's a big question. And there's really two important thinkers who engage this question. And these two are Robert Nozick and John Rawls. Interestingly, Robert Nozick and John Rawls was about 20 years older than Robert Nozick, but these individuals were both contemporaries, and actually they died almost at the same time in the early 2000s. But Nozick and Rawls were contemporaries, and Rawls famously wrote his theory of justice, and Robert Nozick wrote a response to it. Both Nozick and Rawls were incredibly impressive philosophers of the 20th century, and they took on some of the great dilemmas of ethics and of epistemology and these types of things, and of course of the concept of justice. And together, these two thinkers, in a philosophical way, outline a basic kind of split in society today when it comes to justice. So on the one hand, Robert Nozick, who's pictured above, Robert Nozick he's more of a libertarian, if you understand that term. Robert Nozick believes that the government should be minimalistic, that the government should be as minimalistic as it can, and that basically freedom of property ownership and independent wealth are the most principal aspects of society. So Robert Nozick believes that individualism is the answer to society, and that the government should not infringe on society beyond providing a most basic defense, but that the government should let the chips sort of fall as they may, and should not infringe on society to create greater equality. Nozick believes that the kind of natural just form of existence is that individuals are allowed to maximize their individuality, and that governments do not attempt to infringe on this individuality in an attempt of creating what he might call an artificial equality, but instead society has to be allowed to sort of, in his perspective, function naturally. He did not exactly believe in inalienable natural rights. In fact, he believed that in a truly free society, voluntary slavery could in fact be possible. So he didn't exactly believe in inalienable rights in the same way that John Locke did. And John Locke would have said that in no case in a free society should a person's right to liberty be infringed upon. But for Nozick, a free society was more of something that the government had to leave its hands off and allow individualism sort of to drive and dominate society. So his interpretation was more of a libertarian interpretation on the idea of natural rights. By contrast, John Rawls, who's pictured below, was really a utilitarian, if you guys remember that term from earlier lessons. He was really a utilitarian, and so John Rawls believed that he does not believe in inalienable natural rights in the way that Locke does. Meaning that John Locke basically believed that we had natural rights endowed from a creator, that natural rights were beyond us and were effectively created in our existence apart from us. Rawls does not believe that either. Rawls believes that people have what we call natural rights, but Rawls believes that these rights are given to people, created by people in a just society. And for Rawls, the creation of a just society amounts ideally to a society in which there are no unfair advantages, in which there's true equal access to education, in which the wealth of society is seen as a whole, and in which mutual cooperation, sharing of wealth, and a more fair distribution of wealth make up the true essence of society. So you see a very decisive split between different forms of thought in the modern era that are all engaging this question of natural rights in society and injustice in society. Is the accurate approach Robert Nozick, who's a libertarian, who says that effectively the government should do nothing to create equality in society, that in effect infringing on individuality for Robert Nozick would be a violation of justice and natural rights? Or is John Rawls correct, that the government should be engaged in society to create equality and justice and to uplift everybody's natural rights? From the perspective of John Rawls, if you're born into a neighborhood that in a family or a broken family that effectively takes away any chance of fair survival in society, that effectively society has denied you your most basic rights to justice. And so for Rawls, the idea in society is that society should create justice and equality, and that the more just society, the more equality and the more fairness and the more community. So these are two major interpretations that political thinkers engage still to this day. And both these thinkers, of course, remember, they only recently passed, and both were incredibly brilliant philosophers of the 20th century, and they both provided profound and strong arguments for one interpretation or the other, whether a libertarian interpretation or more of a utilitarian sort of reform socialist interpretation. Anyway, so natural rights, again, fundamental factor in the founding of American society, but the big question is, how do we view natural rights? What does this mean? And in terms of how we look at that, that dictates, again, how we use government in society. Do we use government in a minimalistic sense? Or do we use government to promote a more just and equal society? These are big questions that we're dealing with today. Okay, guys, I hope this is helpful.